You found 2 letters in blue ink on a paper record in room 14B, 2 letters that should not have been there, EK, your supervisor's initials, on a medication entry that the electronic system had no record of anyone amending. You cross-checked 2 more patients. Same initials, same discrepancy, 3 patients whose records said one thing on paper and a different thing in the system. You filed an internal report that evening at 5:47 p.m. Within 48 hours, your supervisor knew you had filed it. Your HR director had told him. Within 6 weeks, your union representative was managing the situation on your supervisor's behalf. You had reported a patient safety problem and ended up with 3 people whose job was to protect you working against you instead. It took 14 months to get out of that building systems and into the States. The state board did not answer to Regional Memorial's HR department. This is what happened when they walked in. On the morning of March 3rd, 2 state health board inspectors walked into Regional Memorial Hospital carrying laptops and a briefcase, and the particular expression of people who have already read everything and are now here to confirm it in person. Dr. Ellis Kovacs was suspended before noon. The suspension order was served to him in the corridor outside the physician's lounge on the 2nd floor, which you know because you were on the 2nd floor at 11:38 a.m. and the corridor is not wide. He looked at the document for a long time before he said anything. Then he looked up, and for a moment his eyes swept the corridor in that particular way that tells you a person is looking for someone specific. He did not find that person. You were not where he expected you to be. You had never been where he expected you to be. That had been the consistent theme of 14 months. Your name was on the staffing board at Regional Memorial Hospital as charge nurse for the medical surgical unit, which was a title you had earned across 9 years at that hospital through the accumulation of the kind of clinical credibility that does not come from credentials alone. 9 years is long enough to know every corridor and every supply room and every shift supervisor and most of the code patterns that particular building produces under stress. It is long enough to know which physicians can be reached at 3 a.m. and which cannot. Which pharmacists double-check the unusual requests and which approve them quickly. Which patients on a given floor are going to be the source of the next escalation and why. 9 years is enough time to understand a clinical environment not as a system but as an organism, and to know when something inside it has started to move in a direction that is not compatible with what an organism of this kind is supposed to be doing. Dr. Ellis Kovacs had been a physician at Regional Memorial for 12 years. He was a senior internist with privileges across 3 units and a patient list that occupied a significant portion of the medical surgical floor's daily census. He was efficient in the way that high-volume physicians learn to be efficient, which is to say he moved fast, made decisions quickly, communicated in a style that assumed the people around him would keep up, and did not spend time on what he considered unnecessary elaboration. He was not warm and he did not pretend to be, which at least was consistent. He said things like, "We protect our patients, that's the job," to junior staff in a tone that implied the statement was a standard he held everyone else to and had long since personally transcended. You had worked alongside Dr. Kovacs for 6 of your 9 years at Regional Memorial. You respected his clinical ability and you kept the appropriate professional distance from everything else. That distance was about to become relevant. The first thing you noticed was the medication log for October 3rd. It was a Tuesday in mid-October, and you were completing your end-of-shift documentation review for the medical surgical floor when you pulled the log for room 14B as part of a routine reconciliation. Patient in 14B had experienced a medication response irregularity during the previous night shift, and you were following the standard process of cross-referencing the administered medication record against the physician's order log and the pharmacy dispensing record. It was the kind of review you had done hundreds of times without finding anything. The log showed the expected entries. The pharmacy record matched. The physician order was present. What should not have been present was a handwritten amendment to the medication dosage in the physician's entry, initialed in blue ballpoint pen with the letters EK. The amendment changed the documented dosage timing. It was the kind of change that, in the electronic record system that Regional Memorial used, should have been impossible to make post-entry except through a formal amendment process that generated an automatic audit trail. The electronic record showed no amendment entry. The paper overlay printout, which was kept as a backup in the physical patient file, had been amended by hand. In blue pen. After the fact, without an audit trail, you looked at it for a long time. Then you pulled the records for 2 other patients that Dr. Kovacs had recently seen following irregularity events. One was a patient from September 17th. One was from August 28th. Both physical records. had handwritten amendments initialed EK in blue ballpoint pen. Neither amendment appeared in the electronic audit trail. You understood immediately what you were looking at, and the understanding settled in your chest the way serious things settle, not dramatically but with a weight that does not move, dramatically but with a weight that does not move. Ellis Kovacs had been amending patient medication records after the fact by hand on the physical paper backup copies to change what the record showed had been administered in cases where a near miss or irregularity had occurred. He was altering the documentation to make the irregularities disappear from the formal record. Patients were at risk. The amended records were inaccurate, and any physician or nurse treating those patients going forward would be working from records that had been deliberately falsified. You sat with that for 15 minutes. Then you did what a charge nurse with 9 years in that building and a clear understanding of what the role required was supposed to do. You filed an internal incident report through Regional Memorial's clinical quality reporting system, documented the 3 records you had identified, described the nature of the amendments and their discrepancy with the electronic audit trail, and submitted it at 5:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. You identified Dr. Kovacs by name. You attached digital photographs of all 3 physical records, showing the handwritten amendments and the EK initials in blue ink. You were as precise and as specific as you knew how to be because you understood that the credibility of a report like this depends entirely on what is in it. You sent it. You went home. You made dinner. You did not sleep easily. What you did not fully anticipate was the speed and comprehensiveness of what happened next. Within 48 hours of your report, Dr. Kovacs requested a meeting with you. The meeting was held in his office on the 3rd floor, a small room with a window overlooking the staff car park, and he asked you to walk him through your concerns. You did. He listened. He said that handwritten amendments to paper backups were sometimes necessary when the electronic system had a lag, which was a technical justification that you were familiar with because it was not entirely without basis, but which did not explain why none of the amendments appeared in any electronic record, including the system's own lag reconciliation log. You noted this. He said he would review it. He said the system had anomalies. He said it calmly. He said, "We protect our patients, that's the job," with the same confident inflection he used with junior staff. You noted that too, because by this point you had started documenting. You had started documenting the morning after filing the report on a Wednesday because something in the quality of the 48-hour silence before Kovacs requested the meeting had told you that the silence was not neutral. You recorded a voice memo at 6:43 a.m. in your car before your first shift back, summarizing what you had filed, what the photographs showed, and what you expected might happen next. You kept every voice memo time-stamped and saved to a personal cloud account. You started a written log in a notebook that never left your bag. Date, time, location, what was said, who was present, verbatim where possible, and close paraphrase otherwise. You did this with the same discipline you brought to clinical documentation because you had been a nurse long enough to understand that the difference between what happened and what can be proven to have happened is almost entirely a question of records. The formal complaint process at Regional Memorial ran through the HR director, Linda Rao, and through the hospital's quality compliance officer. Linda Rao had been HR director at Regional Memorial for 9 years, the same 9 years you had been a charge nurse, and in that time you had interacted with her professionally a handful of times without ever forming a strong impression of her in either direction. You formed one now. Linda's first meeting with you regarding your report was 3 weeks after you filed it, which was already a delay that the hospital's own quality reporting protocol did not support. She met with you for 40 minutes. She was not hostile. She was something more difficult to navigate than hostile. She was procedurally correct and substantively useless. She took notes. She explained the review process. She said the report had been received by quality compliance and was under review. She said Dr. Kovacs had provided a response. She declined to share the content of that response. She said the process was ongoing and that you would be updated at the appropriate stage. She said this with the confidence of a person who had decided that the appropriate stage was somewhere past the point where the issue resolves itself. You left that meeting and went back to the floor and documented it in your notebook at 4:17 p.m. Linda Rao had communicated nothing. She had occupied 40 minutes competently. The report was alive somewhere in the compliance system, but nothing was moving. And then Brandon Cole appeared. Brandon Cole was the staff representative for your union local, which meant his function was specifically to represent your interests in any dispute with hospital management. He reached out to you in November, 3 weeks after the Linda Rao meeting, having heard through the staff network that you had filed a clinical quality report that involved a physician. He said he wanted to make sure your rights were protected through whatever process was unfolding. He said this with a warmth that felt specific and personal. You met with him for an hour. You told him what you had found, what you had filed, and what you had filed, and what had happened since. He was attentive and sympathetic. He said he had your back. He said the union would support you through the process. He said this more than once. What he did not say, what you had no way of knowing at that moment, was that Brandon Cole and Dr. Tooth Ellis Kovacs had been playing recreational golf together for 4 years, and that the conversation you were having with your supposed advocate was going to be summarized for his friend within 24 hours. You found this out 6 weeks later when a colleague, a nurse named Asha Mendes, who had been at Regional Memorial for 15 years and who trusted you with it because she trusted you more than she trusted the institution, told you quietly in the break room that Brandon had told someone he was managing the complaint on Kovacs' behalf. Asha had heard this from a source she would not name in a conversation she had not been meant to hear. She told you because she thought you should know. You thanked her without elaborating on what you intended to do with it, because you had already understood by this point that the full weight of what was happening to you was not going to be resolved through the institution. You were now 6 weeks past your initial report. The internal process was static. The HR director was performing process without progress. Your union representative was working for the other side, and Dr. Kovacs was still seeing patients, still making rounds, still amending paper records when it suited him. Nothing had changed clinically. The risk to patients that you had reported in October was still present, and there was now a personal dimension to the situation that you had not fully appreciated until it arrived. In December, you were informed by Linda Rao that your annual performance review would need to reflect certain concerns about professional conduct and interpersonal dynamics on the floor. You had received commendation-level performance reviews for 7 of your 9 years at Regional Memorial. Your 8th review had been strong. Your 9th was now going to document concerns that had not been raised in any previous conversation, supervision meeting, or incident record. The timing was not a coincidence. The framing was retaliatory, and both you and Linda Rao understood that, though only you were putting it in your notebook. You documented the conversation in detail at 6:20 p.m. that evening, including Linda's specific language and the absence of any prior documented concern about your professional conduct. You documented your own clean record of 9 years. And then you went home and typed up a summary of everything that had happened since October 3rd with dates and names and direct quotations, and you emailed it to yourself with the subject line, Documentation Log for Regional Memorial Complaint current through December 12th. You also contacted an employment lawyer named Kwame Asante, who specialized in healthcare whistleblower protection cases, and scheduled a consultation for the following week. Kwame Asante read your documentation at the consultation meeting with the particular focused attention of a lawyer who is evaluating the quality of evidence in real time. He asked 2 questions. First, had you reported outside the hospital chain of command at any point? You said no, you had used the internal systems as required. 10. Did you have independent evidence that the records you had photographed had been altered beyond the photographs themselves? You said you believed the electronic audit trail discrepancy was independent evidence and that you had documented the discrepancy with specificity. He said that was meaningful. He said the stronger move, given the failure of the internal process and the evidence of retaliation, was to file a complaint directly with the State Health Board's Patient Safety Division. He said this process would bypass Linda Rao, bypass Brandon Cole, and bypass every layer of institutional protection that Dr. Kovacs had apparently assembled around himself. He said, the State Board does not answer to Regional Memorial's HR department. You filed the State Health Board complaint in January, 14 weeks after your initial internal report. The complaint included all documentary evidence, photographs of the 3 amended records, your voice memos transcribed, your written incident log complete through January, the discrepancy documentation showing the absence of electronic amendment records for the 3 cases, and a written account of the institutional response including the performance review retaliation and the Brandon Cole conflict of interest. You filed it under your name. You were not anonymous. You were protected from employment retaliation under the state's healthcare whistleblower protection statute, which Kwame had outlined clearly, but you understood that protection and immunity were not the same thing and that the months ahead would not be comfortable. They were not comfortable. The state board's preliminary review process ran from January through early March, which meant you were still working at Regional Memorial, still on the medical surgical floor, still doing your job at the standard you had always maintained, while the institution that employed you operated with what appeared to be no awareness that a state investigation was now active. You were on the receiving end of a performance review that documented concerns you had never previously been confronted with. You were passed over for a scheduling preference you had held for 3 consecutive years. Colleagues who had been friendly became carefully neutral in a way that told you the staff network had been told something, though you could not verify what. Brandon Cole sent you a 3-line email in February informing you that your union support matter had been resolved and closed. He did not explain how. You forwarded it to Quaim and logged it with a timestamp. Through all of this, you documented every shift, every interaction with Linda Rao, every change in scheduling or resources or professional treatment that differed from the baseline of your previous 9 years. You recorded voice memos on the drive home. You typed them up 3 evenings a week. You sent weekly summary emails to yourself with the subject line format, RMH log week of date. The documentation log, which had started with 3 photographs of amended medication records in October, had grown by March to 48 typed pages, 61 voice memos, and a photograph index of 37 images. You kept 3 copies, cloud, personal laptop, and a USB drive stored at your parents' house. On the morning of March 3rd, the inspectors walked in. The State Health Board's Patient Safety Division had completed its preliminary review and determined that the complaint merited a full on-site investigation. They arrived unannounced, which you later learned was standard protocol for site investigations of this type because announced inspections give institutions the opportunity to alter the environment being inspected. They identified themselves to the hospital's administration and requested immediate access to the patient records you had identified, the electronic audit trail for those records, the physical file backups, and Dr. Kovacs's full patient documentation history for the preceding 24 months. They also requested access to the quality compliance system and the record of your original internal report and its institutional handling. The investigation took 3 days on site. During those 3 days, you were interviewed by the State Board investigators for a total of 4 hours across 2 sessions. You gave them your complete documentation, all 48 pages plus the voice memos and the photograph index. You answered every question they asked and offered nothing they did not ask for. The investigators were efficient and gave nothing away, which is how investigators are supposed to behave, and you respected the professionalism of it even when the neutrality was difficult to read. The audit trail discrepancy that you had first noticed in October was not, it turned out, limited to the 3 cases you had found. The State Board's records review, which reached back 24 months, identified a total of 11 patient records with physical paper amendments that did not correspond to entries in the electronic system. 11 cases. 3 of those 11 patients had experienced adverse outcomes that were now traceable, at least in part, to the discrepancy between the actual administered medication and the record that had been amended to show something different. The patients had not been told about the near-miss events. The record amendments meant those events were invisible in the formal documentation. Any subsequent treating physician working from that record would have had no knowledge of what had actually happened. Kovacs was suspended, the patients had been told, and before I close this story, the State Health Board's findings report was 47 pages. It was completed in the 2nd week of March and shared with Regional Memorial's administration simultaneously with its public filing. The lead investigator, a physician and former clinical director named Dr. Bar Sowell, summarized the findings to the hospital's executive team in a meeting you were not present for but were told about by Kwame, who had spoken with one of the board's administrative contacts. Dr. Sowell opened the summary by saying, "We protect our patients, that is the job. That has not been the practice in this unit for at least 2 years." The words were familiar. You had heard them before from a different mouth with a different meaning? Dr. Ellis Kovacs was suspended on March 3rd. His clinical privileges at Regional Memorial were placed on immediate hold. The State Board's findings report was the basis for a formal disciplinary proceeding before the Medical Licensing Board, which is the body with authority over a physician's license to practice. The proceedings ran their course over the following months. Linda Rao resigned as HR Director at Regional Memorial in April following a separate internal review of the quality complaint handling process and the performance review she had issued against you, which a review panel found to have been retaliatory and inconsistent with the hospital's own employee protection policies. Brandon Cole's union role was subject to a formal conflict of interest investigation by the union's regional body. He moved to a different division. Dr. Ellis Kovacs had been changing patient medication records. Not fixing genuine errors, changing records to make near-miss events disappear from the formal documentation. Patients were treated by subsequent physicians using records that no longer reflected what had actually happened to them. He had been doing it for at least 2 years before you found the first blue ink initial in room 14B. Dr. Kovacs was suspended before noon on March 3rd. The board's proceedings concluded in the manner that medical licensing proceedings conclude when the documentary evidence is sufficient and the pattern is clear. Linda Rao's retaliatory performance review was formally struck from your personnel record. The hospital issued a patient notification for the 11 affected cases. None of these things undid the 2 years in which the records had been wrong. But the records were corrected now. The patients were told the physician who had been altering them was no longer practicing. You were still a charge nurse on the medical surgical floor at Regional Memorial. You stayed because the floor needed people who knew what they were doing and because leaving would have been a reward for the people who had spent 14 months trying to make you leave. The medication log for October 3rd was now part of a state health board record that would exist in perpetuity. The voice memo you had recorded at 6:43 a.m. in your car on a Wednesday morning in October summarizing what you had found and what you thought might happen next was in that record too. You had been right about what you had found. You had been right about what would happen. 14 months of being right while people tried to make you wrong was not a victory. It was just the work. The blue ink initial in room 14B had been a small thing in isolation. 2 letters, a ballpoint pen. Paper record in a physical file that most people would have reconciled without reading carefully. It was a small thing and it was a small thing and it was the thing. Most of the time that is how these things start. Not with something obvious, not with a moment that announces itself. With 2 letters in blue ink on a page that someone hoped no one would read carefully enough to notice.